The rain had not stopped for 3 hours. It clung to her hair, slipped down her face, mixed with the tears she refused to wipe away. Imani Brooks stood on the sidewalk outside the glass building she used to walk into like she owned the world. Now she stood there alone. One small suitcase at her feet. One thin coat wrapped around her shaking body. The security guard didn't even look at her when he said it. "You can't stay here," her heart tightened. Not from the cold, from the silence behind her. Inside that building the lights were warm. Laughter echoed faintly through the glass. Her name, once spoken with respect, was now whispered like a warning. "You lost everything." She had heard it all day. From the news. From her husband. From the man who had taken it all. Imani swallowed hard. Her fingers curled slowly around the handle of the suitcase. For a moment, it looked like she might break. But she didn't. She stepped forward. The doors opened. And inside, under the bright lights and watching eyes, Marcus Cole turned, smiled, and said it again, louder this time. She lost everything. Phones rose. People laughed. Imani didn't move. Her eyes locked on his. And just as the room filled with noise, a voice cut through it. "Ms. Brooks." The lawyer stepped forward. The room went silent. The silence did not come all at once. It moved across the room in waves, starting from the front, where the lawyer stood, and spreading outward until even the faint hum of conversation dissolved into nothing. Phones lowered slowly. Eyes shifted. The laughter that had filled the space just seconds ago seemed to vanish, leaving behind a heavy, uncomfortable stillness that pressed against every chest in the room. Marcus Cole did not like silence. It made him feel exposed. He adjusted his cufflinks, his smile tightening just slightly, the first crack in the perfect image he had spent years building. Imani Brooks stood in the center of that silence, her coat still damp, her hands steady now, no longer shaking the way they had outside in the rain. Up close, the signs of struggle were still there. Faint tear tracks, tired eyes, the weight of days spent alone. But there was something else, too, something harder to define. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was control. The kind of control that did not need to announce itself. Before anything else could happen, the lawyer cleared his throat and spoke again, his voice calm, measured, carrying across the room with quiet authority. "Ms. Brooks, I've been looking for you." His words hung in the air unanswered, as every person present tried to understand why a lawyer, an expensive one by the look of him, would be addressing a woman everyone believed had just lost everything. Marcus stepped forward, inserting himself into the moment with practiced ease. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said smoothly, placing a hand lightly on the back of a chair, as if he owned not just the room, but every breath inside it. "Imani is no longer affiliated with this company. If you have business matters, you should direct them to me." His tone was polite, almost friendly, but there was a sharp edge beneath it, something cold and dismissive. He did not even look at her when he said it. Imani's lips parted slightly, but she did not speak. Not yet. Instead, she let her gaze move slowly across the room, taking in the faces she once knew so well. People who had stood beside her. People who had celebrated with her. People who now avoided her eyes, shifting uncomfortably, pretending to be interested in anything but the truth unfolding in front of them. That social layer of emotion, the judgment, the distance, the quiet rejection, settled over her like a second skin, but she did not flinch. "Actually," the lawyer replied, turning his attention to Marcus with a calm that bordered on unsettling, "my business is with Ms. Brooks." He paused just long enough for the weight of that statement to sink in. "And it's quite urgent." No one spoke. The silence said everything. That moment, brief suspended charged, was where the story seemed to begin. But the truth had started long before this room, long before the rain, long before anyone whispered that Imani Brooks had lost everything. It had begun years ago in a smaller office with cracked paint on the walls and a second-hand desk that wobbled slightly whenever she leaned too hard on it. Back then, there was no Marcus Cole, no polished boardroom, no expensive suits. There was only Imani, a vision, and a stubborn belief that she could build something real. She had started the company with nothing but a loan, a plan, and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. Long nights blurred into early mornings. Her hands had shaken then too, but from exhaustion, not fear. She learned every part of the business herself, from negotiating contracts to managing shipments, from handling clients to fixing problems no one else even saw coming. People underestimated her in those early days. They saw a woman trying to break into a space that did not welcome her, and they expected her to fail quietly. Instead, she succeeded loudly. The company grew. Slowly at first, then all at once. Contracts came in. Money followed. The small office became a larger one, then a building, then the sleek glass structure she now stood inside, soaked from the rain and surrounded by people who pretended they did not remember who built it. That was how success worked. It rewrote history in real time. Marcus Cole entered the picture at the height of that growth. He had come recommended, smart, experienced, someone who understood scaling a business beyond its early stages. He had shaken her hand with confidence, looked her directly in the eye, and told her he believed in what she was building. Back then, his voice had carried warmth. His smile had felt genuine, and his presence had seemed like an opportunity. Imani had always trusted her instincts, and at first they told her he was an asset. For a while he was. He worked hard. He impressed investors. He spoke the language of expansion in a way that opened doors she had been knocking on for years. Together they pushed the company further than she had ever imagined. The numbers climbed. The recognition followed. They became a story people talked about, a partnership that worked, a business that thrived. But success changes people. Or maybe it reveals them. It started small. Subtle shifts. Decisions made without her input. Financial reports that felt slightly off, though never enough to prove anything. Marcus would explain things smoothly, confidently, always with just enough detail to make her doubt her own instincts. "It's just a timing issue," he would say, or "we had to move quickly." Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together they formed a pattern. Imani noticed. She did not confront him right away. Instead, she watched. She listened. She paid attention to the details others ignored. That was how she had built the company, and it was how she would protect it. The more she observed, the clearer it became. Marcus was not just making decisions. He was positioning himself. At the same time, her personal life began to unravel. Derek, her husband, had once been her biggest supporter. He had believed in her when the business was just an idea, when the money was tight and the future uncertain. But as the pressure increased, as the cracks in the company began to show, his support faded. Conversations became arguments. Arguments became silence. And silence, she would learn, is often more dangerous than anger. "You're working too much?" he said one night, his voice low but sharp, as she sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. "You don't even see what's happening anymore." "What's happening?" she asked, looking up, her eyes tired but steady. "This," he replied, gesturing vaguely at everything, the papers, the house, her. "You're losing control." The words hit harder than she expected. Her chest tightened. Her heart skipped, then steadied. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to explain that she was holding everything together the best way she knew how. But something stopped her. A small voice, quiet but persistent, whispering that maybe he was seeing something she wasn't. Or maybe he was already choosing a side. Back in the present, in the cold, bright boardroom, Imani could feel all of it layered inside her. The past, the pain, the quiet realizations that had come too late, or perhaps exactly when they needed to. Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders relaxed just slightly. The room watched her, waiting for her to break, to cry, to confirm the story they had already accepted. But she didn't. Instead, she took one step forward, her voice soft when she finally spoke, but clear enough to cut through the tension. "You've been looking for me?" she asked the lawyer. "Yes," he replied, meeting her gaze directly. "And I believe you'll want to hear what I have to say." Marcus laughed, then a short, dismissive sound that broke the tension just enough for him to regain his footing. "This is ridiculous," he said, shaking his head as if the entire situation were beneath him. "She has nothing left. There's nothing to discuss." Imani turned her head slowly, her eyes settling on him again. For a brief moment, something flickered there, something deeper, sharper, almost unreadable. And then she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, it wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was enough. Enough to make Marcus's laughter falter. Enough to make the room shift again just slightly. Enough to suggest that the story everyone believed might not be the full truth. Nobody spoke. The silence said everything. The smile did not last long. It didn't need to. It had already done its work, planting something small and unsettling in the room, a quiet doubt that refused to settle. Marcus felt it immediately, even if no one else could name it yet. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he straightened his posture, as if reclaiming control of a moment that had slipped half an inch too far out of his hands. Control mattered to him. It always had. "Let's not turn this into a scene." He said, his voice smoother now, but the edge sharper. "Imani, you've been through a lot. Everyone here understands that. But this is business, and business moves forward." He gestured lightly to the room, to the employees watching, to the polished table, to the company that now carried only his name in every official document. "We've already made that decision." Imani did not respond right away. Her fingers rested loosely at her sides, no longer curled, no longer shaking. Inside, though, her chest tightened, her heart pressing hard against her ribs as old memories pushed forward without permission. This room. These people. The same table where she had once sat at the head, making decisions that shaped lives, where her voice had carried weight, where her presence had meant something. Now she stood at the edge like a stranger being allowed to linger just a little too long. The injustice had not started today. It had started months ago, quietly, invisibly, long before anyone whispered that she had lost everything. It had started with numbers. At first, it was small discrepancies. A delayed payment here. An unexpected expense there. The kind of irregularities that happen in any growing company. The kind that could be explained if you didn't look too closely. Marcus always had an explanation ready, delivered with calm confidence and just enough detail to sound convincing. "It's a timing issue," he would say. "We had to shift funds temporarily." Or, "It's strategic, we're positioning for a bigger return." Each answer landed neatly, like a piece of a puzzle that almost fit, but almost wasn't enough for Imani. She began staying later, reviewing reports herself, cross-checking numbers that no one else bothered to question. The more she looked, the more the pattern emerged. Not chaos, not coincidence, but intention. Money wasn't just moving. It was being redirected, controlled. One evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, she sat alone in her office, the glow of the computer screen casting sharp light across her face. Her eyes burned from hours of staring at spreadsheets, but she kept going, her fingers tapping lightly against the desk as she pieced together fragments of information. Her breathing slowed, steady, controlled, even as something deeper inside her began to tighten. Looking for something, Marcus's voice broke the silence behind her. She didn't turn immediately. She finished scanning the line she was on, saved the file, then leaned back slowly before facing him. He stood in the doorway, jacket off, sleeves rolled, looking relaxed, almost amused. "Just making sure everything adds up," she replied, her tone neutral. "It always does," he said, stepping into the room. "That's why you brought me in, remember?" She studied him, then really studied him the way she hadn't allowed herself to before. His posture was easy, his expression open, but his eyes were watching her too closely, measuring her reaction, calculating. "Of course," she said quietly. That was the first time she knew. Not suspected, not worried. Knew. But knowing something and proving it were two different things. And in business, proof is everything. The weeks that followed moved faster than she could fully control. Marcus began taking more authority, stepping into meetings she used to lead, speaking on behalf of the company, as if he had always been the one in charge. Investors responded to him. The board listened to him. His confidence was contagious, and in a world driven by perception, that was often enough. Then came the meeting. It had been scheduled suddenly with little explanation. The board, Marcus, a few key executives, and Imani. She walked into the room with her usual composure, her spine straight, her face calm, even as her heart beat harder than she liked. Something felt off. The air itself seemed heavier, like a storm waiting to break. Marcus stood at the front, a file in his hand, his expression serious in a way that immediately shifted the mood. "We've identified a major financial issue," he began, his voice steady but weighted with concern. "One that puts the entire company at risk." Imani felt it before he said her name. A tightening in her chest, a subtle drop in the room's temperature. The way eyes began to move slowly toward her. "We've traced the irregularities back to internal mismanagement." Marcus continued, flipping open the file. "Specifically, to decisions made under Ms. Brooks's direct oversight." The words landed like a physical blow. Not loud, not explosive, just heavy. Final. What Imani's voice came out lower than she expected, her throat tightening around the word. Her hands remained still, but inside her pulse surged, her mind racing through everything she had seen, everything she had suspected. This wasn't just manipulation. This was a setup. Marcus didn't look at her immediately. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of the accusation settle over the room. Then he turned, his expression almost regretful. "I didn't want to believe it either," he said softly. "But the numbers don't lie." The board members shifted in their seats. Papers were passed around. Charts, figures, documents carefully prepared to tell a very specific story. A story where Imani was no longer the founder who built the company, but the liability that threatened to destroy it. Her eyes moved across the pages, her breath steadying even as her heart pounded harder. The data was real, but the interpretation was not. It had been rearranged, reframed, twisted just enough to make her look responsible. "Those numbers are incomplete," she said, lifting her gaze, her voice firmer now. Marcus shook his head slowly. "They're accurate," he replied. "And they've already been reviewed." "By who?" she pressed, leaning forward slightly, her knuckles turning white against the table as the pressure built in her chest. "By people who know what they're doing," he answered, his tone cooling. The room shifted again. The social layer of emotion, the doubt, the judgment grew stronger. People avoided her eyes. Others watched her too closely, waiting for her to crack, to react, to confirm what they were beginning to believe. Derek was there too, sitting off to the side, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. She looked at him, searching for something, support, recognition, anything that connected him to the man she once trusted. He didn't move. "Derek," she said quietly, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. "You've seen the accounts." His jaw tightened. He exhaled slowly, his eyes finally meeting hers for a brief second, before shifting away. "I've seen enough," he said. Her heart dropped. Not fast, not dramatic. Just a slow, heavy fall that seemed to echo inside her chest. "Enough to know this isn't right." She asked, the words barely holding together. "Enough to know something went wrong," he replied, his voice flat. Something went wrong. The phrase echoed in her mind, hollow and meaningless. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't even an accusation. It was distance. Cold, deliberate distance. Marcus stepped in again, seizing the moment. "We're not here to assign blame," he said, though every word he had spoken had done exactly that. "We're here to protect the company." "And how do you plan to do that?" Imani asked, her voice steady now, almost too steady. He slid a set of papers across the table toward her. "By making a necessary transition." Her eyes dropped to the documents. Her name, her position. The terms were clear. Resignation. Immediate. Voluntary. The room held its breath. Imani stared at the papers for a long moment, her vision narrowing slightly as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Her hands were still, her breathing controlled. But inside her heart pounded, each beat louder than the last, each one carrying the same question. Is this really happening? She lifted her gaze, slowly looking around the room one last time. Faces she had trusted, people she had built something with, now silent, watching, waiting. Nobody spoke. The silence said everything. Imani picked up the pen. Her fingers tightened around it, the metal cool against her skin. For a fraction of a second, it looked like she might stop, like she might fight, like she might refuse. Instead, she lowered the pen to the paper and signed. The sound of the pen against paper was soft, almost invisible, but in Imani's chest, it felt like something louder, heavier, final. When she lifted the pen, the room exhaled as one, a quiet release of tension that made it clear everyone had been waiting for that exact moment. Marcus did not rush to take the documents. He let them sit there for a second longer, as if savoring what had just happened, then stepped forward and picked them up with slow, deliberate care, like he was claiming something that had always been his. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm, almost gracious, though there was no warmth in it. "This is the best decision for everyone." Imani didn't respond. Her hands rested lightly on the table, her fingers still, her breathing controlled, but her chest felt tight. Her heart pressing hard against her ribs in a rhythm she could not quite slow. She stood there for a moment longer, looking at the paper that had just erased years of her life in a single signature. Then she stepped back. Nobody stopped her. Nobody said her name. That silence followed her all the way out. The next morning, the story broke. It spread fast, the way bad news always does. Headlines didn't need proof. They needed impact. Founder steps down amid financial mismanagement. Internal issues shake rising company. Her name was everywhere, but not in the way it had been before. No longer attached to success, to growth, to vision. Now it carried doubt, suspicion, failure. Her phone didn't stop ringing, at first. Then it did. The calls changed. Clients she had worked with for years suddenly needed to reevaluate. Partners spoke in careful, distant tones, their words polite but their meaning clear. Friends texted instead of calling. Then they stopped texting too. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, gradual. The kind of disappearance that feels almost polite until you realize what it really is. She was being erased. By the end of the week, Marcus Cole was everywhere. Interviews, articles, panels, his voice calm, confident, controlled. He spoke about stability, about moving forward, about protecting the company. He never raised his voice. He never spoke badly about Imani directly. He didn't need to. The implication was enough. Difficult decisions had to be made, he said in one interview, his expression serious, his tone measured. But we're focused on the future now. The future. It didn't include her. At home, the tension that had been building for months finally broke. Imani stood in the living room, her coat still on, the silence in the house heavier than anything she had felt in that boardroom. Derek stood near the window, his back half turned to her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He didn't look at her when she walked in. "They're saying I mismanaged everything?" She said quietly, her voice controlled, but there was a faint tremor beneath it, something fragile that hadn't fully broken yet. Derek didn't respond right away. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling, as if he were carrying something too heavy to set down. When he finally turned, his expression wasn't angry. It wasn't even cold. It was distant. "They're not saying it for no reason," he replied. The words landed harder than anything Marcus had said. Imani felt it in her chest, a sharp tightening that made it difficult to breathe for a second. "You don't believe that?" she said, stepping closer, searching his face, her eyes wide, almost pleading. "You know me. I know what I've seen," Derek said, his voice flat, his gaze steady but detached. "I've seen the accounts. I've seen the reports. I've seen how things have been going." Her hands trembled, then just slightly, her fingers curling into her palms as she tried to hold on to something that was slipping away too fast. "Those reports were manipulated," she said, her voice rising just a fraction before she forced it back down. "You know Marcus saved the company," Derek cut in sharper, now his jaw tightening. "While you were losing control." The room went still. Her heart stuttered, then pounded harder, louder, each beat echoing in her ears. For a second she couldn't speak. The words sat in her throat, heavy and tangled. "Saved it," she repeated, barely above a whisper. "That's what it looks like," he said. "Looks like." Imani shook her head slowly, her breath uneven, now her chest tight. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "You're just going to believe that after everything?" Derek looked away. That was the answer. The silence stretched between them, thick, suffocating, filled with everything that wasn't being said. The years, the trust, the love that had once felt solid enough to hold them both. It felt fragile now, temporary. "I can't do this," Derek said finally. His voice lower, quieter, but more final than anything else he had said. "Not like this." Imani's breath caught. "What does that mean?" "It means I need space," he replied, though his tone suggested something much larger than that. "This situation, it's not stable, and I can't tie myself to something that's falling apart. Something, not her. Something." Her hands dropped slowly to her sides, her shoulders sinking just slightly as the weight of his words settled in. "So you're leaving," she said, the statement simple, stripped of emotion, because anything more would have broken her voice completely. Derek didn't answer directly. He walked past her toward the bedroom, his steps steady, deliberate. When he returned, he had a bag in his hand. That was his answer. The door closed behind him with a quiet click. Imani stood there, frozen, her body still, her mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. Her heart pounded hard in her chest, then slowed, then pounded again, uneven, unsteady. She took a breath, then another, her hands rising slightly before falling back to her sides. No tears came at first. Just silence. The kind that fills every corner of a room and makes it feel too small, too tight, too empty all at once. By the next morning, the house felt different. Larger, colder. The absence of his presence louder than any argument could have been. Imani moved through it slowly, mechanically, gathering what she needed, leaving behind what no longer mattered. She didn't linger. She didn't hesitate. There was nothing left to hold on to. By afternoon, she stood outside the building she had once called home, a single suitcase at her side, the sky heavy with rain. It started as a light drizzle, then grew steadier, soaking through her coat, her hair, her clothes. She didn't move. A neighbor glanced at her from across the street, then looked away quickly, pretending not to notice. Another door opened, then closed. Curtains shifted. Eyes watched, but no one came out. She was alone. Truly alone. Imani wrapped her arms around herself, her body shaking now, not just from the cold, but from the weight of everything that had been taken, everything that had fallen apart in such a short time. Her chest tightened again, her heart aching in a way that felt almost physical, like something pressing down from the inside. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the rain fall, letting the silence settle around her. Then she opened them, and something shifted. It was small, subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. A steadiness, a quiet, controlled breath. Her hands stopped shaking. The tears that had threatened to fall didn't. She bent down, picked up her suitcase, and stepped forward into the rain. What nobody saw in that moment, what nobody could have understood, was that she was not just walking away. She was moving into something she had been preparing for far longer than anyone realized. And as she disappeared down the street, the rain swallowing her silhouette, the story everyone believed continued to grow louder. But the truth was still quiet. The rain that soaked her that night never really left her memory. It stayed in her bones, in the quiet spaces between thoughts, in the way her body remembered what it felt like to stand alone while the world moved on without her. But what no one knew, what no headline ever printed, what no whisper ever carried, was that Imani Brooks had not been as unprepared as she looked. She had seen it coming, not all at once, not in one clear moment, but in pieces. Small, quiet pieces that most people would have ignored. It started with a file. Weeks before the board meeting, before the accusations, before the word mismanagement was ever attached to her name, Imani had been reviewing a set of internal transfer logs late one night. The office was empty, the lights dim, the city outside reduced to reflections on glass. Her eyes were tired, her hands slightly shaking from hours of work, but something in the numbers caught her attention. A transfer that didn't make sense. Then another. Not large enough to trigger alarms, not obvious enough to stand out, but consistent, deliberate. Her chest tightened. Her heart slowed instead of racing, a quiet instinct, kicking in the same instinct that had built her company from nothing. She leaned forward, scanning deeper, pulling records, cross-referencing accounts. The pattern didn't just exist, it repeated. Someone was moving money. Carefully. Intentionally. She didn't confront Marcus that night. She didn't confront anyone. Instead, she closed the file, leaned back in her chair, and sat in silence, her mind working through possibilities, her breathing steadying as the truth began to take shape. This wasn't a mistake. This was a plan. And she was already inside it. The next morning, she did something no one expected. Nothing. She went to meetings. She spoke to clients. She smiled when she needed to. From the outside, nothing changed. But inside, everything shifted. Every word Marcus said, every decision he made, every move he took. She watched it all differently now. She stopped reacting. She started preparing. 3 days later, she met Earl Johnson. The building's maintenance room sat on the lowest level, far from the polished offices and glass walls above. It smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and old metal, the air cooler quieter, almost forgotten. Most people never came down there. They didn't need to. Imani did. Earl was standing near a workbench when she walked in his hands, steady as he tightened a bolt on a piece of equipment. He didn't look surprised to see her. He didn't look curious either. He simply glanced up, nodded once, and went back to what he was doing. "You came," he said. After a moment, his voice calm, low. Imani stepped further into the room, the door closing softly behind her. "You said I should," she replied. He set the tool down, slowly wiping his hands on a cloth, before turning to face her fully. His eyes were sharp, observant in a way that made it clear he missed nothing. "I said you might need to," he corrected gently. She studied him, her chest tightening slightly, as the weight of everything she had discovered pressed forward again. "You've been watching," she said. "For a long time," Earl replied. There was no judgment in his tone, no accusation, just truth. Imani exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly. "Then you know what's happening." Earl nodded once. "I know enough." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full of understanding of unspoken things that didn't need explanation. "I can't stop it," she said finally. The words quiet, controlled, but heavy. Earl tilted his head slightly. "Can't or won't?" the question lingered. Imani's fingers curled slightly at her sides, her heart tightening again, not from fear this time, but from the weight of a decision she had already made. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a brief moment something in her expression softened. "If I stop it now," she said slowly, "I only prove part of it." Earl's eyes narrowed just slightly, understanding flickering there. "But if I let it happen?" She continued, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "They show everything." Nobody spoke. The silence said everything. Earl walked over to a small metal locker and opened it, pulling out a thin black folder and a small USB drive. He held them for a moment, then extended them toward her. "You'll need this," he said. Imani hesitated for half a second, then reached out her fingers, brushing against his as she took the items. The contact was brief but steady, grounding. "What is it?" she asked. "Insurance," Earl replied. She nodded slowly, her grip tightening slightly around the folder. "And you?" she asked. "Why are you helping me?" Earl's expression didn't change, but something deeper moved behind his eyes. "Because I've seen this before," he said. "And I've seen what happens when nobody speaks." Imani held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. No more questions. No more explanations. Some truths didn't need to be unpacked. She left that room differently than she entered it. Not lighter, not safer, but ready. From that point on, everything she did had purpose. Every document she signed, every meeting she attended, every moment she stayed silent when she could have spoken. It wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Back in the present, in the boardroom, where everything had finally come to a head, that same silence wrapped around her again, but it felt different now. It wasn't suffocating, it was controlled. Marcus watched her carefully, the unease he felt earlier growing just enough to make him uncomfortable. "This is pointless," he said, his tone sharper now. "Whatever this is, it changes nothing." Imani turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his again, calm, steady. "Are you sure about that?" she asked. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Something in the room shifted again, subtle but undeniable. The employees who had been laughing minutes ago now stood still, their expressions uncertain, their confidence fading as doubt crept in. The lawyer stepped forward, opening his briefcase with measured precision, pulling out a set of documents and placing them on the table. "These were filed 3 weeks ago," he said. Marcus frowned, stepping closer, his hand tightening slightly at his side. Filed by who, he demanded. The lawyer didn't look at him. He looked at Imani. She didn't lose everything he said, quietly. The words landed like a crack in glass. Marcus's breath caught just for a second. His chest tightened, his mind racing to reassemble control, to make sense of something that no longer fit the narrative he had built. Imani didn't move. Her hands were still, her breathing steady. Her eyes locked on his. And for the first time since she walked into that room, Marcus Cole looked unsure. The silence stretched. And this time, it wasn't on his side. For one suspended second, the room existed inside Marcus Cole's uncertainty. It was small, barely visible. Just a flicker in his eyes, a tightening in his jaw, a pause a fraction too long before he spoke again. But in rooms like this, power was often measured in fractions, in hesitation, in the tiny breaks between performance and truth. Marcus had built his entire rise on the appearance of certainty, on the polished confidence of a man who always knew more than everyone else. Now that image had a crack in it, and every person in that boardroom felt it before they understood it. "What does that even mean?" Marcus asked, his voice clipped, now less smooth than before. He stepped toward the table and snatched up the top page the lawyer had placed there. His eyes moved quickly across the document, then narrowed. He looked up too fast. "This is irrelevant." The lawyer remained calm. "It is not irrelevant. It changes nothing." Marcus snapped louder this time. The volume changed the air immediately. Several employees flinched. One of the assistants near the door lowered her phone completely. Another shifted his weight and looked at the floor. Social pressure had carried them into cruelty earlier. Now that same social pressure began pulling them the other way, toward fear, toward doubt, toward the uncomfortable realization that they may have laughed too soon. Imani saw it all. She stood near the end of the table, rain-damp hair, framing a face that no longer looked broken, no longer carried the helplessness Marcus had counted on. The tears that had threatened earlier were gone. Her hands were still. Her breathing was even. Inside, her heart beat hard, but steady, not with panic, but with timing. She had learned long ago that there are moments when silence works harder than speech. This was one of them. Marcus threw the page back onto the table with a short, sharp motion. "Fine," he said, forcing a thin smile back onto his face. "Let's say you filed something. People file things all the time. That doesn't change reality." She resigned. The board voted. The company moved on. "Did it?" Imani asked. Her voice was soft, almost gentle. That made it worse. Marcus turned to her sharply. "Yes," he said. "It did." Nobody spoke. The silence said everything. The lawyer placed another document on the table, then another. The restructuring agreement filed 3 weeks ago transferred controlling protections to a separate holding framework, pending review of executive conduct, he said. It was lawful, pre-authorized, and triggered under conditions that now appear to have been met. Marcus stared at him. Executive conduct, the lawyer folded his hands. Yes. Imani watched Marcus's face change again. He was still fighting for composure, but now she could see the effort. See the pressure building under his skin. The polished mask was still there, but it was slipping. It reminded her of the first time she realized exactly what kind of man he was not, because he had shouted, but because he had smiled while someone weaker was cornered. Months earlier, before the resignation, before Derek walked out, Marcus had started holding informal finance meetings without her. He called them efficiency reviews. He said they saved time. He said the company needed stronger centralized execution. She let him talk. She let him gather people around him. She let him believe he was invisible in his ambition. And quietly, carefully, she began moving the real future of the company beyond his reach. Not the visible company, not the logo on the glass walls or the headline-ready offices. The real future lived in contracts, protected relationships, contingency authority, and a sister entity built to hold the most valuable operational agreements if internal compromise occurred. Marcus never saw that part, because Marcus never respected anything he could not publicly control. He chased what looked powerful. He never thought to ask whether the thing he was fighting to steal had already been hollowed out and moved. That was his weakness. And greed always has a weakness. In the present, he turned from the lawyer and looked toward the board members as if expecting rescue. "You all approved the transition," he said. "You've seen the losses. You've seen the reports." No one answered immediately. One board member, an older man named Franklin Reeves, cleared his throat. His fingers tapped once against the table. "We approved a transition based on the information we were given." Marcus's eyes sharpened, which was accurate. Was it? Franklin asked more quietly than Marcus had expected. The room shifted again. Marcus laughed, but the sound came out wrong. Too brittle, too fast. "This is absurd. We're standing here acting like some technical filing outweighs the fact that she nearly buried this company." At that, Imani's chest tightened, not from fear, but from the old pain of hearing her own work twisted into a weapon against her. She remembered the nights she had stayed until dawn, the meals skipped, the calls answered from hospital waiting rooms when her mother was sick years ago, the pressure she absorbed so the company could keep breathing. She remembered loving the thing they now said she had failed. Her fingers pressed lightly into her palm. No shaking. "Not now." The lawyer spoke again. "The accounts didn't freeze by accident, Mr. Cole." Marcus went still. That landed. He looked back at the lawyer slowly. "What accounts?" "The accounts linked to the unauthorized transfers," the lawyer replied. The words dropped into the room like iron. Two employees near the far wall exchanged a fast glance. A woman from compliance, who had been silent the entire time, lifted her eyes suddenly toward Marcus. One of the younger executives swallowed hard. Everyone felt the same thing at once. The ground had moved. Marcus's expression hardened. "Unauthorized," he said. "Be very careful with that word." "Oh, I am," the lawyer said. Imani said nothing, but inside she felt the moment tightening toward its next turn. She had known the accounts would lock once the conduct trigger activated. She had known Marcus would not expect it to happen this soon. What she had not fully allowed herself to imagine was the look on his face when control truly left his hands. It was not dramatic yet, not panic, something better. Confusion touched by fear. The beginning of collapse. "This is a stunt," Marcus said now, looking around the room rather than at any one person. "She walks in here dressed like a victim, drags in a lawyer, waves around paperwork, and suddenly everyone forgets what's real, Imani repeated. She finally took a step forward. "You want real." He looked at her, and for the first time there was no warmth left in him at all. Only hostility, raw and visible. "Yes," he said. "Let's hear real." She held his gaze. "Real is you thought you were taking a company. Real is you were taking a shell." The words hit harder than shouting ever could have. A murmur moved through the room. Not loud, but alive. Marcus's face changed. "What did you say?" I said. Imani answered, her tone calm. "You fought very hard for something that was already empty." Nobody moved. The silence said everything. Franklin Reeves leaned forward, now his brows drawn tight. "What exactly does that mean?" Ms. Brooks. Imani turned her head toward him, without taking her attention completely off Marcus. "It means the high-value contracts, protected client structures, and controlling operational rights were reassigned under legal contingency before my resignation took effect. If internal misconduct surfaced, the visible company remained visible. The real power moved." The boardroom went cold. One woman near the end of the table whispered, "Oh my God." Marcus laughed again, but this time there was desperation under it. "That's impossible." "No," Imani said. "It was necessary." His breathing changed. She saw it. Shorter now, shallower, his shoulders rising a little higher with each inhale, his composure no longer effortless, but maintained by force. "You're lying," he said. Imani tilted her head slightly. "Then why are the accounts frozen?" That question sat in the room like a blade. Marcus looked toward the CFO. "Tell them," he demanded. "Tell them this is temporary." The CFO, a careful man who had avoided eye contact all morning, looked visibly pale. His throat moved before any words came out. "We received system restrictions early this morning," he said. "Multiple linked accounts are under review. Large transfers were flagged." Marcus stared at him. "And you're saying this now? You told us not to escalate until after the meeting." The CFO replied, almost in a whisper. There it was. The careless moment. The room heard it, felt it, filed it away. Marcus turned so quickly his chair nearly hit the floor behind him. "You idiot." The outburst cracked across the room. Several people recoiled. The assistant by the door actually stepped back. That social layer of emotion was complete now. The fear, the discomfort, the collective realization that the man who had played polished savior was underneath exactly what Imani knew he was. And still, she did not raise her voice. She just stood there watching him unravel inch by inch. Then, from the back of the room, another voice entered the silence. Low, steady, familiar. "Maybe you should stop talking now, son." Heads turned. At the doorway stood Earl Johnson, still in his maintenance uniform, one hand resting on the frame, the other holding a small evidence pouch with a black USB drive inside. Marcus went pale, and this time everyone saw it. The room did not react all at once to Earl Johnson's voice. First came the turn of heads, then the tightening of shoulders, then that strange collective stillness that settles over people when they sense something important has entered the space before they fully understand what it is. Earl stood in the doorway in his faded maintenance uniform, his back straight, his expression calm, the small evidence pouch in his hand, catching the cold overhead light. He looked nothing like a man who should have been able to shift the balance of a boardroom. That was exactly why the moment landed so hard. Marcus saw him and lost color so quickly it looked unnatural. "Who let him in here?" Marcus asked, but the sharpness in his voice could not hide what had suddenly broken underneath it. His chest rose too quickly. His eyes flicked from Earl to the pouch in his hand, then to Imani, then back again. There was calculation there, but now it was panicked. Calculation rushed and uneven. "This is a private executive meeting." Earl did not move. "You said that last time too," he replied. A murmur moved through the room. People looked at Marcus, then at Earl, trying to piece together what they were hearing. One of the younger executives leaned slightly toward the person beside him and whispered something. Another employee lowered her gaze as if suddenly embarrassed to be standing where she was. The emotional center of the room was shifting now, and everyone could feel it. Fear had once belonged to Imani alone. Now it was beginning to migrate. Imani stood very still near the table, but inside her heart gave one hard, heavy beat. Not from surprise. Earl was supposed to come if things reached this point. Still seeing him there, seeing the timing land exactly where it needed to, brought a quiet pressure into her chest. For months she had held herself together with discipline, caution, patience. She had swallowed humiliation, accepted silence, allowed people to think they had already seen the end of her story. Now the truth was beginning to stand up. It had weight. It had shape. And it had arrived in the hands of a man no one had bothered to see. Franklin Reeves spoke first. "Mr. Johnson," he said slowly, his voice cautious but curious. "You seem to believe you have something relevant to this discussion." Earl stepped into the room, then one measured step at a time, not hurried, not hesitant. "I do," he said. "And if this room still cares about truth more than appearances, then it's past time somebody heard it." Nobody interrupted him. Nobody laughed. Nobody told security to remove him. The room had moved beyond that. Marcus felt it too. That was why his breathing had gone shallow. "This is ridiculous," Marcus snapped, trying to recover authority through force. "He's maintenance staff. He has no standing here." Earl turned his head just enough to look at him. "And you thought that meant I wasn't paying attention." The silence that followed wrapped tight around the room. It was no longer the silence of mockery or doubt. It was the silence of recognition. Something real was about to happen. Earl walked to the table and placed the evidence pouch in front of Franklin. Then he set down a second item from under his arm, a thin folder worn at the corners, but neatly organized. "This drive contains recorded transfer authorizations, internal calls, and document access logs," he said. "And this folder contains printed copies of backup records, timestamps, and restricted entry reports." Marcus laughed once, but the sound was dry, almost cracked. "You expect anyone here to believe you were secretly collecting evidence," No Earl said. "I expected nobody to care until it was too late." The words landed harder than a speech would have. Several people looked away. Imani felt her throat tighten slightly. Not with fear, with memory. Earl had said something like that to her months ago in the maintenance room when she first placed her trust in him. He had not spoken like a dramatic man then, and he wasn't speaking like one now. He was simply telling the truth, the way some older people do when they have lived long enough to stop decorating it. Franklin opened the folder. The general counsel leaned in. A compliance officer moved closer without even realizing she had. One page turned, then another, then another. The air in the room seemed to thin. "What is this?" Franklin asked. Earl did not take his eyes off Marcus. That he said is the part where he stopped stealing in theory and started stealing on paper. Marcus slammed his palm flat against the table. "Watch your mouth." The sudden burst of violence in the gesture made two people flinch. One assistant actually stepped backward until her shoulder touched the wall. Marcus saw it and seemed to realize too late how exposed he had become. His hand remained on the table a moment too long before he slowly lifted it. Imani watched him carefully. She remembered another version of this man, the polished one, the one who smiled through fundraisers, who spoke gently to investors, who called her the heart of the company in public, while quietly rerouting control behind closed doors. The cruelty in him had never really lived in shouting. It lived in precision, in a hand on her shoulder during meetings, in a reassuring tone used to make her question her own instincts, in the way he had let her walk into humiliation while pretending he regretted it. Now that cruelty had lost its costume. The ugliness underneath was plain. The lawyer reached for the USB drive. "We can verify the contents immediately," he said. Marcus turned toward him. "You do that without my approval, and I'll have your license buried." The lawyer looked up slowly. "That threat would matter more if you still had authority over this process." There it was again. Another crack. Franklin looked from the pages in front of him to the lawyer, then to Imani. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "when exactly were these protections put into place?" Imani took a breath. The room shifted toward her now, not with contempt, but with need. They wanted the story to make sense again. They wanted someone to tell them where power actually lived. 3 weeks before my resignation," she said, "after I confirmed unauthorized patterns in executive financial access," confirmed the compliance officer asked. "How?" Imani's fingers pressed lightly together in front of her. "By doing the work myself," she said. "The work people stopped believing I was still capable of doing." That hit the room differently. It was not dramatic. It was not theatrical. But it exposed something more than Marcus's scheme. It exposed the environment that allowed it. The quiet sexism. The polished doubt. The ease with which people had accepted the story of the unstable woman and the competent man. A few faces changed at that. Shame settled where arrogance had been. Franklin's eyes dropped back to the folder. "These entries suggest access from your credentials, Mr. Cole. Late-night pulls, private exports, restricted transfers." Marcus's face hardened into something colder than panic now. "Credentials can be compromised." Earl nodded once. "That's true." Marcus turned to him too quickly. "Exactly." Earl continued. "That's why I also kept the hall camera logs." The room froze. Marcus did too. It was tiny. Barely more than a stilling of breath. But it was enough. The camera outside executive finance doesn't record sound. Earl said, his voice calm, almost conversational. But it does record who went in when and who came out carrying documents they shouldn't have touched. The CFO sat down heavily in his chair, as if his knees had just failed him. The compliance officer pressed a hand to her mouth. One of the board members muttered "Jesus" under his breath. Imani felt the pressure inside her chest ease for the first time in weeks. Not fully. The pain of what had been done to her was still there. Derek's silence. The boardroom betrayal. The night in the rain with one suitcase and nowhere safe to stand. None of that disappeared. But something else rose beside the pain now. Something steady. Something earned. Marcus looked at her then. Really looked. Not at the broken woman he had wanted the room to see, but at the one standing here now composed and impossible to move. A woman who had let him believe he was winning because he needed to go far enough to expose himself completely. "You knew," he said. His voice had changed. Lower, stripped. Imani held his gaze. Enough. He laughed again, but there was nothing left in it. "You let this happen." The room inhaled. Imani did not blink. "I let you keep going," she said quietly, "because half-truths would have saved you." Nobody spoke. The silence said everything. Franklin slowly closed the folder and placed both hands on top of it. For the record, he said, his voice now fully formal, "I am requesting immediate suspension of all unilateral executive authority pending forensic review." Marcus turned toward him, stunned. "You can't do that?" Franklin looked him dead in the eye. "Watch me." Then the lawyer added the words that broke what little illusion remained. "And as of this morning, Ms. Brooks retains protected controlling interest at 51%. This time the shock in the room was not quiet. It moved like electricity. She had not lost everything. She still owned the company, and Marcus Cole, for the first time in years, looked like a man standing on air that was no longer there. The number hung in the air like a verdict. 51%. It didn't sound loud, but it hit harder than anything that had been said in that room all morning. The shift was immediate. People straightened. Eyes widened. A low wave of whispers moved through the edges of the boardroom before dying out just as quickly, replaced by a deeper, heavier silence. Marcus didn't speak. For the first time since anyone in that company had ever known him, Marcus Cole had no words. His chest rose sharply. Then again, his breathing uneven now, his composure slipping in ways he could no longer fully control. His eyes darted briefly to the lawyer, then to Franklin, then back to Imani. He searched for something, an opening, a flaw, a way to reassert control, but there was nothing there. Just truth. Imani stood where she was. Her posture unchanged, her face calm, but inside her chest her heart beat hard, steady, deliberate. This was the moment she had prepared for. Not the humiliation, not the rain, not the loss. This. The moment when silence broke. Franklin spoke again, his tone no longer cautious, but firm, grounded in authority that had returned to him as the facts settled into place. "Ms. Brooks," he said for clarity, "are you confirming that your controlling interest was preserved under contingency protections prior to your resignation?" "Yes," Imani replied. Her voice did not waver. The compliance officer leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly together, knuckles pale. "And the restructuring agreement, this was triggered automatically when financial misconduct thresholds were met?" "Yes," Imani said again. Every answer was simple. Every answer carried weight. Marcus shook his head slowly, the movement almost disbelieving. "No." He muttered under his breath, then louder, "No. That's not how this works. You don't just walk back in here and take everything." Imani turned her head slightly toward him, her eyes steady. "I didn't take anything," she said quietly. "I kept what was mine." The room went still again. The silence said everything. For a moment, Marcus looked like he might explode, anger rising fast, sharp, violent, but it didn't fully come. Something held it back. Not control. Fear. Not of her alone, but of what was now surrounding him, closing in from all sides. The lawyer stepped forward, placing another document in front of Franklin. "In addition to the controlling interest," he said, "there are clauses related to operational authority and asset allocation that you should review." Franklin opened the document, his brow tightening as he scanned the contents. Then he stopped. "What is this?" he asked. Imani answered before the lawyer could. "The real company," she said. Marcus let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're not making any sense." "Actually," the lawyer said calmly, "she is." The room shifted again. Imani took a slow breath, feeling the weight of everything she had carried begin to lift, not disappear, but redistribute into something steadier, something stronger. "You built your version of this company around visibility," she said, her voice calm, controlled. "The office, the board, the reports, the numbers you could show." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "That's how companies work." "No," she said. "That's how appearances work." He took a step toward her. "Explain." She held his gaze. "The contracts that matter most, the long-term logistics agreements, the protected client structures, the partnerships that actually generate revenue, they're not tied to this entity anymore." The words landed slowly. He blinked once. "What?" "They were reassigned," she continued, 3 weeks before I signed anything. Under legal protection." Marcus stared at her, the color draining further from his face. "You're lying." Am I? She asked. The CFO, who had been silent until now, leaned forward suddenly, his voice shaky. There were discrepancies in the revenue projections, he admitted. We thought it was a delay in reporting, but it wasn't. The compliance officer finished, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't. The truth settled in. Marcus looked around the room, searching for support, for denial, for anything that would anchor him back to control. But what he found instead were eyes watching, calculating, pulling away. The social layer had flipped. He was no longer the man everyone followed. He was the man everyone was distancing themselves from. You fought so hard, Imani said softly, her voice cutting through the tension for something that was already empty. The words hit him harder than any accusation. His jaw tightened, his hands clenching slightly at his sides, his chest rising too fast again. That's not possible, he said, but the certainty was gone now, replaced by something brittle. It was necessary, she replied. Nobody spoke. The silence said everything, and then a voice broke it. Imani. The sound was familiar. Too familiar. She turned slowly. Derek stood near the back of the room, just inside the doorway, his expression tight, his eyes wide, his entire posture uncertain in a way she had never seen before. He looked like a man who had just realized he had misread everything. Her chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't from shock. It was from clarity. You should have told me, he said, stepping forward, his voice low, almost pleading. I would have. You would have, what she asked, her tone calm but sharp enough to stop him mid-step. He hesitated. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. The answer didn't come. Because there wasn't one. I thought you lost everything, he said, finally, the words sounding weak even as he spoke them. Imani nodded once. You did. The room shifted again. Derek swallowed hard, his throat tight. I didn't know, he said, his voice breaking slightly now. If I had known, you would have stayed, she asked. The question hung between them. Heavy, unavoidable. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Her eyes softened just slightly, not with forgiveness, not with regret, but with something quieter, final. You didn't lose me, she said, her voice steady, each word clear. You walked away. The words landed like truth always does, clean, direct, impossible to ignore. Derek stepped back, the weight of them hitting him all at once, his shoulders dropping, his expression collapsing into something close to regret. But regret came too late. It always did. Before anyone could speak again, the doors opened. Not slowly, not politely, with purpose. Two officers stepped inside, their presence immediate, undeniable. The room froze, every movement halting, every breath catching at once. Marcus turned toward them, his body going rigid. What is this? He demanded, but his voice no longer carried authority. It carried strain. The lead officer looked directly at him. Marcus Cole. Yes, he replied, though the word came out tighter than he intended. We need you to come with us. The room went silent. Again. But this time the silence wasn't heavy. It was final. Marcus let out a short laugh, shaking his head. On what grounds? The officer stepped forward, his tone calm, official. We'll explain that outside. Marcus looked around the room one last time. No one moved. No one spoke. No one came to his defense. His chest tightened again, his breathing uneven, his eyes landing on Imani one last time. She didn't look angry. She didn't look satisfied. She just looked steady. And that was worse. Much worse. For a moment, Marcus didn't move. The words, "We need you to come with us," hung in the air, but his body seemed unable to respond, as if reality itself had stalled around him. His chest rose sharply, then again, his breath catching halfway, like his lungs had forgotten how to work. His eyes flicked from the officers to the board, then to the employees lining the walls, searching for something, support, denial, anything that could anchor him back to control. He found nothing. The room had already decided. "I'm not going anywhere," he said finally, his voice louder than necessary, forcing strength into a moment that no longer belonged to him. "This is a misunderstanding." The lead officer didn't react. "Sir, we're not asking." That landed. Marcus's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. For a split second, it looked like he might argue further, might push back, might try to reassert dominance the only way he knew how, through force, through volume, through presence. But something stopped him. Not fear alone, exposure. The kind that strips a man down to exactly what he is in front of everyone he once controlled. Imani watched him carefully, her hands still at her sides, her breathing slow and steady. Inside her chest, her heartbeat firm, grounded, no longer racing, no longer uncertain. This was the moment people always imagined would feel like victory, loud, satisfying, explosive. But it wasn't. It was quiet, measured, heavy. Marcus turned to her, his eyes sharp now, desperate beneath the anger. "You did this," he said, his voice low, almost shaking. "You set me up." Imani held his gaze. "I let you keep going," she said. The distinction cut deeper than blame ever could. His chest tightened again, his shoulders rising with each uneven breath. "You let me," he repeated, disbelief breaking through the edges of his voice. "You think that makes you better than me?" She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Nobody spoke. The silence said everything. He took a step toward her, the officers shifting slightly, their presence tightening the space around him. "Say it," he demanded, his voice cracking now, no longer controlled, no longer composed. "Say you planned this. Say you wanted this." Imani's eyes didn't waver. "I wanted the truth," she said quietly. The words didn't rise. They didn't fall. They simply existed. And that was enough. Marcus let out a short, broken laugh, shaking his head, his composure finally collapsing under the weight of everything pressing down on him. "Truth," he said. "You think anyone cares about truth? They care about money, power, winning." He gestured wildly to the room, to the people who had once followed him, believed him, stood behind him without question. "And I won," he said, though the words sounded hollow, now empty even to his own ears. Imani tilted her head slightly. "Did you?" she asked. That was it. That was the moment. The final break. Marcus's shoulders dropped just slightly, his breath catching again, his eyes darting once more around the room, looking for confirmation, for agreement, for anything that would make her wrong. No one moved. No one nodded. No one spoke. The silence said everything. The officer stepped forward. "Sir, we need you to come with us now." This time Marcus didn't argue. He exhaled slowly, his chest sinking his body, losing the tension that had held it upright for so long. His hands loosened at his sides, his posture shifting not into surrender exactly, but into something close enough. As they reached for him, he pulled back just slightly, not enough to resist, but enough to turn his head one last time toward Imani. His eyes met hers. And in them, for the first time, there was no arrogance, no control, no certainty, only the realization of what he had lost. "Say it again," Imani said. Her voice was soft, calm, unshaken. Marcus froze. The officers paused just for a second, sensing the weight of the moment without fully understanding it. Imani took one small step forward, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. "Say it again," she repeated. "Who lost everything?" The room held its breath. Marcus's throat moved as he swallowed, his jaw tightening, his eyes flickering with something that looked dangerously close to breaking. His chest rose, then fell, uneven, unstable. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because for the first time he knew the truth. The officers guided him forward, their hands firm but controlled, leading him toward the door. He didn't fight. He didn't speak again. His steps were slower now, heavier, each one carrying the weight of everything that had just collapsed around him. As he reached the doorway, the entire room watched. No one smiled. No one clapped. No one said a word. The silence said everything. And then he was gone. The door closed behind him with a quiet, final click. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, almost carefully, the room began to breathe again. The compliance officer lowered her hands from her face, her expression still stunned. The CFO sank back into his chair, staring at the table as if trying to understand how everything had shifted so completely. A few employees exchanged quiet glances, their earlier confidence replaced by something much heavier: awareness, maybe even shame. Franklin Reeves stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket, his gaze settling on Imani with a level of respect that had not been there before. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice steady, formal, but different now. "We have a lot to discuss." Imani nodded once, but she didn't move toward the table. Not yet. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the door where Marcus had just disappeared, then back to the room, to the people who had watched her fall, and now stood watching her rise. Her chest lifted with a slow breath. No tears. No anger. Just clarity. And something else. Something quieter. She turned slightly, her gaze landing on Derek, who still stood near the back, frozen, his expression caught somewhere between regret and disbelief. For a second their eyes met. Then she looked away. Because that part of the story was already finished. The room remained silent as she stepped forward, not back into the space she once held, but into something new, something she had rebuilt piece by piece, in silence, in patience, in truth. And this time, everyone saw it. The building felt different without him. Not louder, not brighter, just clearer. In the days that followed, everything moved with a quiet precision that felt almost unfamiliar. Meetings still happened. Emails still went out. Contracts were reviewed, restructured, reassigned. But the tension that had once lived under every conversation, the unspoken pressure, the subtle fear, was gone. In its place was something steadier, something real. Imani Brooks did not rush back into the spotlight. She didn't call a press conference. She didn't sit for interviews. She didn't stand in front of cameras to tell her version of the story. Instead, she went to work. The first morning she returned, she arrived early before most of the staff had come in. The office was quiet, the soft hum of the building filling the space. She walked through it slowly. Her steps measured, her eyes taking in everything with a calm focus that hadn't been there before. This place still carried pieces of her: the long nights, the hard decisions, the sacrifices no one ever saw, but it no longer defined her. That was the difference. She stepped into the conference room where everything had shifted just days earlier. The chairs were neatly arranged, the table clean, the air still holding a faint echo of that moment, the silence, the truth, the collapse of everything that had been built on lies. She placed her hand lightly on the back of one of the chairs. For a second her chest tightened, not from pain, from memory. Then she let it go. By the end of the week, the internal review confirmed everything. The unauthorized transfers, the falsified reports, the access logs Earl had preserved. Every piece of evidence lined up cleanly, leaving no space for doubt, no room for interpretation. Marcus Cole's name, once spoken with respect, now carried a different weight entirely. His reputation didn't collapse loudly. It dissolved, quietly, completely. People stopped saying his name. That was the real fall. Earl Johnson didn't ask for recognition. He came in the same way he always had early in the morning, moving through the building with steady, quiet purpose. But something had changed. It wasn't in how he worked. It was in how people saw him. The same employees who had once walked past him without a glance now nodded, spoke, paused just long enough to acknowledge that he had been the one person who stood still when everyone else turned away. Imani found him in the maintenance room again, a few days after everything settled. He was working on a panel, tools laid out neatly beside him, his movements precise, unhurried. "You were right," she said. He didn't look up immediately. "About what? That people don't care," she replied. "Not until it's too late." He tightened one last bolt, then set the tool down before turning to face her. "You made them care," he said. Imani shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "I made them see. The difference mattered." He nodded once, understanding settling in his expression. No more needed to be said. Derek came back. Of course he did. Not immediately. Not when the story first broke. He waited until things were clearer, until the truth had settled, until it was safe again to stand near her without being questioned. Imani saw him in the lobby one afternoon, standing near the entrance. His posture uncertain, his hands shifting slightly, as if he didn't know where to put them. He looked older somehow, smaller. I heard everything he said when she approached, his voice low, careful. I didn't know. I didn't understand what was happening. Imani listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react. I should have stayed. He continued, his throat tightening slightly. I should have trusted you. Her chest felt still, not heavy, not broken, just still. I thought you lost everything, he said. She nodded once. You did, she replied. The words landed softly, but they didn't bend. Derek's shoulders dropped slightly, the weight of them settling in. Can we? He started, then stopped, the rest of the sentence catching in his throat. She looked at him, her expression calm, her eyes steady. I lost everything, once she said quietly. And I learned something from it. He waited. She didn't rush. If someone can walk away from you when you have nothing, she continued, they don't deserve to stand next to you when you have everything. The silence between them held. He didn't argue. He couldn't. She gave him a small nod, not unkind, not harsh, just final. Then she walked past him and didn't look back. Months later, the company was stronger than it had ever been. Not bigger, better. The right people stayed. The wrong ones disappeared. The systems that had once been vulnerable were now solid, protected, built with a level of care that only comes from surviving something that almost breaks you. Imani didn't talk about what happened. She didn't need to. Her work spoke. Her presence spoke. And the silence she carried now wasn't empty. It was earned. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to see the truth clearly. The people who stand beside you when you are strong are easy to find. The ones who stay when you are broken are rare. Trust actions, not words. Because in the end, money reveals character, but loss reveals truth. If this story moved, you take a moment to share where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Stories like this remind us we're not alone, no matter how quiet things feel. And if you believe in truth, resilience, and rising stronger than before, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next.